This is an item that we have discussed once before. It would rethink the way that we regulate residential density in many zoning districts. And I realized that there was one attachment that did not get sent out, so let me hand that out. And what this is every major housing project that's been approved in the city since 2008. I'm sorry about the small print. And you'll see some highlights in a column that says variance of minimum lot area. And the highlight there is that of the projects that have been approved in recent years, since we last revisited this issue of minimum lot area per dwelling unit, 24% of those have been granted variances of this minimum lot area standard. So that is maybe an indication that that standard isn't working very well.
Have there been any requests that were turned down?
Not that I saw.
I don't see anything on your list.
So essentially what we would be doing is maintaining things that would still have a practical effect on limiting density, such as maximum heights, maximum setbacks, minimum parking requirements, maximum floor area ratio. However, we'd be essentially saying that if you can meet all of those other standards, put as many dwelling units into the building as you see fit from a market standpoint. There is also a minimum dwelling unit size, of course, of 350 square feet for residential efficiency units and 500 square feet for everything else. That is not being proposed to change as part of this amendment.
Jason, let me ask you something. If it isn't being changed as part of this amendment, isn't there a marketing trend? Ted and I read the same article in the New York Times. Isn't there a marketing trend towards these many apartments that they go down to 250 now, don't they?
Yeah.
Should we do something about that, or should we wait for the supply-demand?
Yeah.
One bite at a time, as John.
Okay, good point. Good point.
I've
good
been
point.
reading some of those same articles about, especially on the coast, there being more demand for those micro units.
Yeah.
We haven't seen a lot of that here yet. There have been a couple of projects where they've kind of wanted to push that a little more. But so far, there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest.
I think Ted's point is good. One bite at a time. We'll wait and see what happens.
And this would certainly take away an existing disincentive to build smaller units.
Right.
One way to think about this is that in a hypothetical project right now, somebody might have the ability to construct a 40-unit building with 80 units, but within the same building envelope, based on the way we regulate density, they couldn't build an 80-unit building with 80 bedrooms. But it would be the same building. Mm-hmm. Ironically, with a building with more units in it, they'd have to provide more parking, even though in theory there could be this exact same number of adults, drivers living inside that building. So again, parking is going to be one thing that really places a practical limit on how many units somebody can put in the building. One discussion we've been having among staff is, I think we're reaching a consensus that the R3 district is a district that we should leave alone with this amendment, because it's really intended to be a lower density townhouse type of district, and we really aren't that interested in seeing people trying to push the envelope with bigger apartments and condominium buildings in that district. We're also thinking even about the R4 district as being more of a medium density district, that maybe we don't even want to see those higher intensity districts there, higher intensity developments there. On the list that I handed out to you about projects that approved since 2008, there has only been one major development project approved during this time in an R4 district. And that is in northeast Minneapolis, the Jackson Flat, which I think is under construction now.
So are you suggesting that's a situation unlikely to recur or come up very often? That's not.
There are two possible scenarios. One is that, well, we've been too restrictive in R4, therefore there hasn't been a lot of development there.
Mhm.
Or the scenario is that if we make this change, suddenly we will get a lot of major projects in R4 that might end up being more than we bargained for in R4. In the map that I'm handing out right now, you can see that the R4 district is really kind of a district that is featured on corridors in some cases, especially along Lowry North. But it's also found in the middle of some neighborhoods like Whittier, West Phillips, south of Lake Street here and there.
Oh, there's some of them.
A little bit in Linden Hills.
Scary.
And of course, Heritage Park has, you'll see a big swath of R4. So not to focus too much on this R4 issue, but it's one of the biggest things we're thinking about for this amendment right now. Other options there would include lowering the maximum floor area ratio in R4, or lowering the maximum height in R4. It's a 4-story district right now. We could lower that to 3. R5 is up to 4 stories, R6 is up to 6 stories. That would almost be kind of a natural progression. Our staff is kind of evenly split on whether that's a good idea right now. I think the staff, for the most part, is thinking, let's just maintain the regulations that we have in that district right now, rather than making certain things in that district more restrictive. But I'm interested in knowing whether you have some thoughts about that.
Well, do you think that getting rid of this minimum lot area might all of a sudden make an R4 much more attractive than it has been in the past?
I think the concern is that suddenly it will be too attractive for higher density when we really want it to be medium density.
And
So,
because
yes.
we are leaving in place these other regulations to limit the volume of buildings, the number of square feet. And perhaps that leaves R4 too bulky, too many square feet allowed, thus too many units if we're too doing that.
Potential.
That's a good question. Is R4 kind of intended to be the graduated step down towards going from a R1 and R2, where you've got very small buildings, up to the R6? So the idea is to put that in there to kind of buffer that transition for the neighborhoods.
In some places, yes, I would say that is the case.
Because in that case, if that's what it's being used for, yeah, having a height restriction might be the way to go to keep that from too crazy.
Well, height restrictions just requires UP to go beyond them, but an FAR restriction would require a variance, which is a more severe test. So that I'm sure is why you're thinking that might be
That's
the way
true.
to go.
So, I mean, if you were to, because the more I think about it, I think that having just removing the minimum lot area in R5 and R6 makes sense. So could it just be applied to R5 and R6 districts?
Absolutely, and R5 and R6 are the residence districts that are designated as high-density districts.
And I think, personally, I think it makes sense to go to higher density and then leave R4 and R3 as is, as a buffer, kind of in between. On the other end, if someone wanted to rezone up to an R5 or R6, then wouldn't then the minimum lot area not apply?
That's correct. And we would have to think about whether, from a policy standpoint, R5 is supportable in those locations where they would be proposing to upzone.
So I think that would be a good tool, I mean, to not apply it to R4, because then, you know, if we feel that, well, I mean, just in instances where it's in, let's say hypothetically it's on a commercial corridor where it could support additional density, they could look at, upzoning it to an R5 or R6 if it could accommodate that. But, you know, if it's in a single family neighborhood, an R4, maybe a 3-story or 4-story building at that FAR or MLA would make more appropriate sense versus allowing density, unlimited.
Are you suggesting that this restriction might just be eliminated from R5 and R6 and leave it in place for everything else?
Yes,
But also take it away in the commercial, like the office residence districts.
yes.
So leave it for R1, 2, 3, 4.
4.
That's where I'm leaning.
Yeah, no, I
I think it just makes sense. I mean, especially for buffer areas where you have higher density urban areas and you need a 3- or 4-story building that has appropriate density. I think it makes sense versus having a developer buy all the R4 properties along an R5, you know, anything that butts up to an R5 or R6 and try to cram it as much as possible. I just think that I know that this is probably, you know, a fear, a worst case scenario, but I realistically see something like that happening because it's cheaper property. You know, it's easier to develop a wood frame building that's 4 stories versus, you know, 6-story concrete, 7-story concrete building, which is more expensive to build.
That approach could also save us the hassle of the comprehensive plan policy not lining up with the text, zoning text.
Yes. And I'm sure many of you will remember one of the projects was kind of a poster child for some commissioners saying, we really need to resolve this issue, is the 628 University Avenue Southeast. It was a 4-story building in Marcy Homes. They were proposing quite small dwelling units, which pushed them over the density that they could even request in the R5.
With the variance.
With the variance, but the commissioners thought that the building itself very much fit in with its context. It's a 4-story building, but it just couldn't be accomplished in R5, so it became what we're at the moment is the only R6 zoned property in Marcy Homes. As a result, under this amendment, we could accommodate a building like that in R5
Without rezoning.
without rezoning it. I think this will substantially, if this is adopted, substantially cut down on the number of rezoning applications that we'll be considering.
You mentioned that it would be also used in commercial and, I never remember ORs. But if you've got a teeny little commercial lot somewhere in the middle of residential, is that going to allow then somebody to stick a building that's got half a dozen apartments in it on a corner of, like, say, Lowry and Stinson Parkway?
Potentially, but remember, nothing in this amendment allows buildings to be bigger than they are allowed to be right now, and they'll still have to meet their parking requirement. If they put in a bunch of units on a small lot, how are they going to meet their parking requirement?
I think, based on what I've read, it seems like R5 would be the appropriate cutoff. I feel like this measure of lot area per unit is really only a good standard when we actually want open space or lot area, like in the lower R districts. I think certainly in the commercial districts, it's not really a good measure. And I don't know, Jason, if you can elaborate at all. It appears, just looking through this list, that particularly the larger scale projects are in commercial districts or downtown, there wouldn't be a significant difference in what we'd be getting in most of the districts in terms of building massing. It seems like the FAR requirement and others are limiting that still.
Yes, I agree with that. And yeah, a large I didn't do the percentage, but it seems like a large percentage of the projects on this list are in commercial and in office residence districts. And then a smattering in R5 and R6.
Are the R5 and R6 districts, can you make any generalizations about where they're located? It seems like by and large, development we've seen has been along commercial corridors and other places or around the periphery of downtown where the zoning tends not to be an R district at all.
Maybe the best example is the Midtown Greenway in Lowry Hill East, off the corridor, but in a small area plan designated for higher density. I noticed there were some along West Broadway. There are parts of West Broadway that are really not very commercial in character that have residential R5, R6 zoning. And then it seems that there were some near the university that were R5, R6.
So for the most part, the R5 and R6 are places where we'd want to see density.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, 10.
Well, it's not just more density, but I think every time this came up, we commented that this was discriminatory against smaller units and thus affordable units. And against city policy to have housing for all sorts of people in the city, not just those who can afford larger units. So this is trying to accommodate that without destroying the character of that particular area.
And I need to do a little bit more research, hopefully on this issue before I finish the staff report, but I think we all know that there is a growth in single-person households in the
Change in
it's a
demographics.
nationwide
Yeah.
phenomenon. I think the projection is that will continue in Minneapolis and other places, so that may be another reason why it makes more sense to not create a disincentive for smaller units in buildings.
As I
like
recall,
this.
that's what we found particularly intriguing with that 528 project.
628.
628.
Mhm.
And Dan particularly, I read the New York Times article on the micro that was working for a different kind of householder rather than the big two-bedroom apartment.
So my hope is to still keep this on track for the next public hearing of the Plan Commission.
Great. Okay, well, good luck and thank you.
Good luck.
I mean, it's an issue, but I think it's it's a necessity. I mean, it caters towards a new market of dwellers and people that, like me, I live in a, 800 square foot home. That's our footprint. And we don't need much more, and I wouldn't frankly want more than that. I don't, I just think it makes sense. I wouldn't, I think it makes sense. So if the city can accommodate more people like me, and I think, different types of units, that'd be great.
Well, if we can accommodate more people like you, that's all really good.
Sure. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Okay. I think the only other item that's not on our agenda is, since we have a full commission, once in a while we try to do a social event. So whether that be